He thought he was untouchable, until the woman he assaulted in court turned out to be his new boss. What happens when a decorated police captain falls from grace under the weight of his own crimes? This isn't just a story of justice. It's a reckoning. Watch till the end for a twist you won't believe. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one. The courtroom was electric with tension, every breath drawn tight, every eye fixed forward, as if the entire room knew something irreversible was about to happen. The overhead lights buzzed faintly above rows of solemn faces, casting a sterile white glow over the polished benches and the gleaming floor. It was early afternoon, around 2 o'clock, but the air inside the courtroom felt more like dusk, heavy, still, and waiting for something to break. On one side of the room stood Captain Wade Hunter, a towering figure with a rigid jawline, pressed blues, and the confidence of a man who had spent more than 20 years believing that power was his birthright. Decorated, praised, and protected, Wade Hunter had walked into courtrooms like this dozens of times before, sometimes as a witness, sometimes to intimidate, often just to be seen. Every step he took seemed to say, "I own this place." But across from him, standing in sharp contrast, was a woman whose very presence changed the air around her. Ayana Pierce, poised and composed, stood silently, her shoulders squared, her eyes steady. She wore a fitted navy suit, crisp and professional, but it was her demeanor that held the room captive, an unwavering calm that drew attention without demanding it. For a moment, Wade didn't recognize her. He didn't care to. In his eyes, she was just another mouthy defense lawyer, just another obstacle in a system he believed he controlled. He rolled his neck and stepped forward with the swagger of authority, his badge gleaming under the lights like a weapon. "You people always think you can outsmart the system," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, but aimed directly at her. The words hit like a slap, venom disguised as smugness, and yet Ayana didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even break eye contact. That was the first time something shifted. Wade's smirk twitched, irritation creeping into the cracks of his confidence. He was used to reactions, flinches, protests, fear. That's what he counted on. But this woman just stood there, unmoved, like a mirror held up to his ugliness. And the reflection didn't flatter him. "I'm talking to you," he said, stepping closer. His voice dropped to a gritted whisper. "You think being clever makes you untouchable? That you matter?" Still, nothing. No reply, no fear, just silence that grew louder with every breath. The judge, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and thinning white hair, gave a warning glance but didn't interrupt. He knew better. When officers like Hunter stepped into the courtroom, most people looked away, deferred, stayed quiet. The badge didn't just mean law, it meant protection, immunity, command. But Wade was unraveling, and everyone could feel it. "Too good to answer me?" Wade sneered, his tone sharper now, his pride bleeding through. He closed the distance until he was standing nearly nose to nose with her. "Let me teach you a lesson about respect." And then, before anyone could react, he kicked her. A hard, deliberate, brutal kick to the leg meant not just to hurt, but to humiliate, to put her in her place. The sound of his boot hitting her body echoed through the room, like a crack of thunder, followed by a collective gasp that ripped from every corner of the courtroom. The silence that had hung in the air shattered instantly. People leapt to their feet. One woman screamed, someone else shouted, "What the hell?" The judge's gavel slammed down like gunfire. Bang! 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 But it was too late. The damage had been done. Ayana stumbled, one knee buckling slightly, her hand catching the side of a table. But she didn't fall. Slowly, deliberately, she straightened herself and looked Wade Hunter in the eyes once more. There was no rage in her expression, no panic, just a still, resolute calm. And then, barely but unmistakably, she smirked. Wade's blood ran cold. He had assaulted her. In open court. In front of witnesses, a judge, attorneys, even media observers. But she wasn't crumbling. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't backing down. She was looking at him like she knew something he didn't. And that terrified him. "You son of a—" a voice shouted from the gallery, but it was drowned out by the chaos. Bailiffs rushed in to contain the crowd. Reporters scrambled for their cameras. The judge was yelling for order, pounding his gavel again and again. Wade stood there, suddenly unsure of himself, his boot still planted, his breath shallow, adrenaline fading into confusion. Something was wrong. Something he couldn't name yet. And then, just as abruptly, the courtroom doors swung open. A line of uniformed officers entered. Not bailiffs, not local patrol. These officers wore darker uniforms, internal affairs, and they moved with silent, deadly coordination. At the front of the group walked a woman with braided hair, tucked neatly into a regulation bun, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Ayana Pierce didn't look surprised. She stepped slightly to the side and nodded toward the woman. Wade turned, confused, and froze. Because the woman leading the team, the one with the commanding stride and the clipboard in hand, didn't stop at the gallery. She walked straight toward the bench, toward Wade, toward the woman he had just assaulted. The room quieted again, tension building into something unbearable. Then the commanding officer spoke. Her voice was clear and firm. "Captain Hunter, stand down." Wade scoffed, trying to reassert control. "Relax, I wasn't asking," the officer interrupted, stepping forward, her tone razor-sharp. "Captain Wade Hunter, meet your new commanding officer, Deputy Chief Ayana Pierce." The word struck like a lightning bolt. Wade's face contorted as if someone had physically struck him. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The color drained from his face. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to reset reality. "No," he whispered, but it was already done. The courtroom buzzed again, whispers ricocheting off the walls like bullets. "She's his boss? Did he just kick her? Oh, he's finished." Ayana took a single step toward Wade and looked up at him, her voice even, her eyes piercing. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Captain?" And just like that, the courtroom, the one Wade Hunter had once ruled with confidence, became his crucible. Because nothing he could say, no excuse he could offer, could undo what he had just done. The badge, the reputation, the decades of unchecked dominance. It was all beginning to collapse, and she was still standing. The courtroom, still vibrating from the shock of Captain Wade Hunter's brutal assault, had fallen into an uneasy silence, one not born of peace, but of disbelief. Cameras were still rolling, journalists scribbling furiously, and whispers curled through the aisles like smoke. Every face was turned toward the two central figures, Hunter, flushed with the adrenaline of dominance and fear, and Ayana Pierce, calm, composed, still upright. But then came the second thunderclap, one far more devastating than a kick. The doors at the back of the courtroom had burst open only moments earlier, but the weight of what followed had yet to land. A dozen officers filed in, each moving with calculated precision, their dark uniforms sharp against the sterile courtroom walls. These were not ordinary bailiffs. These weren't local patrolmen. They belonged to internal affairs. Men and women trained not to control the public, but to investigate the very officers who wore the badge. At their head walked a woman with short-cropped hair and the unmistakable air of authority. Her strides were measured, her gaze forward, and flanking her was a man carrying a silver case and a file folder thick with documents. This wasn't a security intervention. It was an arrival, Captain Wade Hunter's smirk faltered the moment the woman's eyes met his. Something in her expression, detached, clinical, utterly unshaken, put a tremor in his chest. He swallowed, his posture stiffening out of instinct. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't how courtroom dominance played out. The woman stopped a few feet from him. Her badge glinted beneath the fluorescent lights. "Captain Hunter," she said sharply, "you are to stand down immediately." Hunter's chest puffed slightly. He was still clinging to the myth of authority. "What is this?" he asked, forcing a scoff, though it landed hollow in the space between them. "I was just doing my job." The woman held up a hand. "Save it. You're not in charge here." Ayana Pierce stepped forward then, just a half step, but it was enough. All eyes swung back to her. Her composure hadn't wavered since the moment Hunter's boot met her leg. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even reached for legal retaliation in the moment. But the look in her eyes now, it wasn't defiance. It was strategy. The lead officer turned slightly toward her, then turned back to the room. "Let me introduce myself," the woman said. Her voice was crisp, emotionless, deadly serious. "I'm Commander Leona Barrett, Office of Internal Affairs. We've come to inform this court and this department that, effective immediately, Ayana Pierce has been appointed as Deputy Chief of Internal Affairs for this district. She is now the direct superior of Captain Wade Hunter." The silence didn't break. It collapsed. The courtroom, already rattled, now seemed stunned into breathless paralysis. Wade Hunter didn't speak. Couldn't. His mouth opened, then closed. His smirk melted into something closer to disbelief, as though someone had removed the oxygen from the room and he was only just noticing. Deputy Chief? His new boss, and the woman he had just kicked. A soft, stunned murmur rippled through the room. She outranks him. She's his superior. The reality set in like a rising tide. Reporters' pens froze mid-sentence. Junior officers leaned forward, trying to make sure they'd heard right. One bailiff even stumbled backward, clearly shaken by the turn of events. Ayana didn't gloat. She didn't move dramatically or smile for the crowd. Instead, she turned her attention to Hunter with surgical precision. "Captain Hunter," she said, her voice smooth and chillingly steady, "you are no longer authorized to participate in today's proceedings. Effective immediately, you are under internal review pending a formal investigation. Remove your firearm and badge." Hunter didn't move. The phrase pending review might as well have been a dagger. Every officer in that room knew what it meant. Not a slap on the wrist. Not suspension. Not even demotion. It meant his career was now under a microscope. And the person holding the lens was the very woman he had tried to humiliate. Still frozen, Wade looked around, grasping for support, for a friendly face, a loyal nod. But even his protégé, Officer Julian Marks, sat rigid behind him, eyes locked downward. Wade's pulse spiked. He hadn't just lost the moment. He had lost control of the entire narrative. Ayana nodded once to Commander Barrett. The Internal Affairs officers stepped forward without fanfare, and Wade was forced to remove his firearm, unclip his badge, and place them both in the silver evidence case. The sound of the badge hitting metal rang out like a bell in a funeral procession. "This is a mistake," he muttered finally, but the words had no volume, no weight. Ayana turned, not to him, but to the judge. "Your Honor, with your permission, Internal Affairs will now take jurisdiction over the handling of Captain Hunter's conduct, both in today's incident and in previous complaints currently under review." The judge blinked, clearly still adjusting to the power shift. After a moment, he nodded slowly. "Granted," and that was it. The courtroom, once Hunter's arena, had become Ayana's domain, and she wasn't wasting time. After the proceedings were adjourned, Ayana didn't leave through the back or slink away. She walked directly down the center aisle, flanked by internal affairs officers, her back straight, her pace steady. Eyes followed her like reverence, or fear. Wade, now sitting alone, cuffless and badgeless, watched her go. For the first time in his career, he felt the edges of something unfamiliar, helplessness, because this wasn't about paperwork anymore. It wasn't about who could shout louder in court. This was institutional, legal, strategic. Ayana had seized the one thing men like Wade Hunter had always used to get away with everything: authority. And now she was using it against him. Back at headquarters later that day, internal affairs agents began their probe. Officers were interviewed. Past complaints against Wade were pulled from archives. Reports that had once conveniently vanished were now resurfacing like bodies in a drained lake. It became clear that this wasn't just about a single courtroom incident. It was about a pattern, a culture, a rot that had been allowed to thrive under Wade's reign. And Ayana was peeling it back layer by layer. That night, the precinct buzzed with unease. The whispers grew louder. Rumors spread like wildfire. Did you hear? She's opening up 5 years' worth of cases. She's got the judge's statement already. Internal Affairs is camping in the conference room. And still, Ayana didn't gloat. She moved through the halls with quiet efficiency, her silence more powerful than 1,000 angry words. Wade sat alone in his office, staring at the wall. Everything he'd built, his image, his influence, his unchallenged command, was unraveling. And it all began with one miscalculation. He thought she was beneath him. He never imagined she'd be the one holding the pen that would write his downfall. The precinct didn't sound the same anymore. Not since that day in court. The day Captain Wade Hunter lost his badge, his gun, and his illusion of control. The energy that once hummed with loyalty and pride now pulsed with unease and quiet anticipation. Conversations lowered to murmurs. Footsteps grew cautious. Even the old coffee machine in the break room, usually buzzing with casual chatter, sat beneath a hush that hadn't lifted in days. And at the center of it all, walking silently through the shifting storm, was Officer Julian Marks. Julian had always admired Wade Hunter. For nearly 4 years, the captain had been more than just a supervisor. He had been a mentor, a protector, a symbol of what it meant to command the room. Julian had followed him into tense calls, backed him up without question, and repeated the mantra Wade had drilled into every recruit he liked. Control isn't requested, it's taken. For a young white officer hungry to climb the ladder, Wade's authority was magnetic. He made the system feel impenetrable, like a fortress with him at the gates. But that illusion cracked the moment Ayana Pierce stood over Wade, her voice calm, her authority unchallenged, while Internal Affairs stripped the man of his rank in front of the entire courtroom. And Julian saw something then he'd never seen before. Fear, real fear. Not in Ayana, in Wade. The next day, Julian returned to the precinct early, hoping to beat the whispers, to find normalcy somewhere in the routine. But nothing felt normal anymore. Not the locker room, where silence reigned, not the briefing room, where people avoided eye contact, and not the patrol car he usually shared with Wade, now permanently parked beside the evidence garage, its keys collecting dust in the captain's former office. He didn't say much to anyone that morning, just nodded, answered when spoken to, and filed reports. But as the day wore on, so did a gnawing feeling. A voice whispering under his skin. What if she's right? What if everything Ayana Pierce claimed wasn't personal, but institutional? Later that afternoon, Julian lingered in the locker room a few minutes longer than usual. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was dread. But something kept him rooted there, staring blankly at the inside of his locker as the voices of two senior officers filtered in from the adjacent corridor. He recognized them, Sergeant Linton and Officer Breck, both longtime allies of Wade, the kind who patted him on the back after rough calls and laughed a little too loudly when he told his war stories. Julian didn't intend to eavesdrop, but when he heard Wade's name, he froze. "Should have known it'd catch up to him eventually," Linton muttered. "That video from 2017, the one with the kid in the alley? We buried that deep." Breck chuckled, but it was thin, uneasy. "Yeah, well, Ayana's digging it all back up. Word is she found the original complaint. The mother filed it twice, but Wade had it rerouted through admin. Said it was a non-issue." Julian's heart kicked once, hard. Another voice joined. Detective Ramos, lower, gruffer. "That's not the only one. You remember Tasha Green? She filed against him back in 2014. Excessive force, illegal stop. Disappeared off the system. Someone did some cleaning back then." A pause. Then, "You think she'll find it all?" "She's not looking to find it," Linton replied. "She already has." The door creaked. Footsteps receded. Julian stood there, stunned, hand still on his locker door. For the first time, he wasn't just hearing rumors. He was hearing confessions, real ones. And they weren't whispered in fear. They were spoken in resignation. Like the fall of Wade Hunter was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. And worse, they all knew. The betrayal hit harder than he expected. Not from them, but from Wade himself. Julian had believed the captain's image, had defended it, repeated it. He had stood by the man. And yet here was the truth. Wade had been shielding himself for years, using the system as camouflage. And somewhere along the way, Julian had become part of the cover. He sat down hard on the bench, elbows on knees, mind spinning. He remembered a case from a year ago, an incident that didn't sit right even then. A teenager pulled over for a busted taillight. Wade had escalated the stop unnecessarily, yanked the kid from the car, shoved him hard into the pavement. The teen hadn't resisted. Julian remembered that part clearly. But when he mentioned it afterward, Wade had brushed it off. "Perception is reality," Wade had said at the time, and if the kid looked like a threat, the force was justified. "That's the game, kid. Learn to play it." At the time, Julian had nodded. Now, the memory made his skin crawl. Over the next few days, the cracks widened. More chatter surfaced. Julian began paying closer attention to archived reports, dates that didn't line up, complaints that disappeared. He accessed public records on his lunch breaks, read testimonies from people who had tried to hold Wade accountable and failed. But most damning of all was the file he found tucked away in an old server backup, an internal memo dated 7 years ago, flagged but never pursued. It detailed a civilian complaint involving Wade's use of force during a routine welfare check. The woman involved had been left hospitalized. No charges were filed. Wade claimed she came at him with a knife. No weapon was ever recovered. Julian stared at the file, the report incomplete, but real. He printed it, staring at the ink as if it might vanish if he blinked. He couldn't look away anymore. What scared him most wasn't that Wade had lied. It was that the system had helped him do it. And Julian, fresh-faced, eager, hungry to prove himself, had become a willing student. That night, alone in his apartment, Julian replayed Ayana Pierce's words in his head. "This isn't personal, Captain. It's systemic." He understood now. The next morning, he didn't put on his usual uniform. He wore plain clothes, drove to headquarters, and requested a private meeting with Internal Affairs. As he sat in the waiting room, heart pounding, report in hand, he thought about the man who had once shaped his entire view of law enforcement. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid to break ranks. The day Julian Marks handed over the file, everything changed. What began as a courtroom incident, a violent outburst by a disgraced captain, was rapidly becoming something else. A doorway. And Ayana Pierce, newly appointed Deputy Chief of Internal Affairs, wasn't about to waste her key. Inside her office, on the 7th floor of Precinct Headquarters, 3 floors above where Wade Hunter once held court with unshakable swagger, Ayana moved like a strategist, not a prosecutor. Her desk wasn't cluttered with vengeance. It was stacked with order. Manila folders, timestamps, digital backups, surveillance transcripts, and suppressed memos dating back almost 15 years. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her silence was a scalpel, and she was now cutting into the muscle of the department with surgical precision. Her review began the morning after Julian's confession. The document he handed over, a memo about a welfare check gone violently wrong, was only one of dozens buried under years of bureaucratic dust. But it was enough. Enough to trigger a full-scale forensic audit of Captain Wade Hunter's record. Ayana started with the obvious cases, the ones that had been quietly settled out of court. She traced them backwards, names of victims who never spoke publicly, complaints that vanished from official logs, medical records that suggested brutality but bore no mention of the badge that inflicted it. There was a disturbing consistency in the patterns. Young black men cited for resisting, women labeled hysterical, bodies bruised but paperwork pristine. Then came the falsified reports. It was Julian, now working discreetly with Ayana's team, who uncovered the audit trail. Years of overwritten files, contradictory statements, evidence logged and then misplaced. Witnesses who mysteriously recanted days after filing. Ayana found one report from 2019 where Hunter claimed a suspect lunged at him during a routine arrest. The body cam footage told a different story. The suspect, barely out of high school, was handcuffed and sitting on the ground when Hunter struck him across the jaw. The footage had never been reviewed. The file had been marked non-critical. Ayana marked it differently. Pattern 6. By the end of the first week, Ayana's case wall, once blank, was lined edge to edge with documentation. Color-coded folders, red pins for physical injuries, yellow for policy violations, blue for civil settlements. The wall pulsed with truth, not rumor, not accusation. Proof. But the deeper she went, the worse it got. She uncovered a cover-up ring. Not a formal conspiracy, but a culture of convenience. Supervisors who overlooked complaints. Clerks who misfiled documents. Detectives who pushed aside evidence that didn't align with the department's version of events. Wade hadn't worked alone. He hadn't needed to. The system itself had become his accomplice. Ayana documented it all. There were 32 civilian complaints tied directly to Wade Hunter between the years 2012 and 2024. Of those, only 4 were formally investigated. All 4 were cleared. None resulted in discipline. 3 had body cam footage that contradicted the reports. 2 were sealed after settlements, the victims silenced by non-disclosure agreements. But it wasn't just what Wade had done. It was what he represented. Ayana began interviewing officers, quietly, away from the main floors. She listened, not just for facts, but for tone. Some spoke cautiously, protecting themselves. Some dismissed the probe, dismissing Ayana herself. But a few, just enough, opened up. They spoke of unspoken rules. Don't question the veteran. Don't second-guess the field narrative. Don't write anything in the report you wouldn't want Internal Affairs to read. Wade had been a master of this culture. He hadn't needed to bark orders. His reputation did the work. The locker room spoke of him like a soldier spoke of war. Loud, glorified, selectively remembered. One officer described Wade as a man who knew when to bend the law to keep peace. Another, younger, said bluntly, "We just thought he was the system." And maybe he was, until now. Because Ayana wasn't just compiling a case against a man, she was assembling a blueprint of institutional rot. Her investigation grew so wide it required a separate team. She brought in analysts, civil rights advisors, even a trauma psychologist to cross-reference the emotional consistency of past complainants. She didn't want headlines. She wanted precision. She knew how departments survived scandals. They sacrificed the symptom and ignored the disease. Not this time. The deeper she dug, the clearer the disease became. Power without scrutiny. Tradition without accountability. Brotherhood without truth. Ayana found documents from Wade's early years on the force. Training logs with exaggerated performance scores. Commendations that had been fast-tracked. She discovered a field training officer who, in a long-forgotten personnel file, described Wade as highly assertive, potentially volatile under pressure. That note had been crossed out in red ink, replaced with a single phrase, "Strong leader." She called that file Origin 1. The more she found, the more obvious it became. Wade's rise had not been in spite of his aggression. It had been because of it. The department didn't just tolerate him. It rewarded him, promoted him, praised him for keeping the streets in line, as though violence was just another tactic. By week 3, the internal review had ballooned into something unprecedented. A decade-long map of misconduct, all leading back to a single man, and all propped up by the silence around him. Ayana didn't blink. She briefed the police commissioner behind closed doors. She laid out a preliminary findings packet, 76 pages, organized by year, incident, and breach of conduct. She attached video files. She highlighted the redacted complaints and matched them to public hospital records. She didn't accuse. She documented. By the time she was finished, the commissioner's face had gone pale. "We've known some of this," he admitted softly. Ayana replied without raising her voice. "Then you'll understand why we can't pretend anymore." What followed was the authorization she needed. The green light. She was officially cleared to expand the investigation department-wide. And as news quietly spread among the ranks, something subtle and irreversible began to shift. Fear. Not the kind of fear Wade once used to maintain his grip, but a different kind. The fear of exposure, of consequences, of overdue justice finally finding its footing. The officers who had laughed loudly in hallways now walked with eyes downcast. The ones who had sided with Wade began calling in sick or moving to different precincts. The air grew still in places where power once swaggered. Ayana never raised her voice. She didn't storm rooms or flash credentials. Her presence alone was enough now, because the department didn't see her as a disruptor anymore. They saw her for what she had become. The reckoning. It was only a matter of time before Wade Hunter fought back. A man like him, used to commanding respect with a raised voice or a silent stare, was never going to go quietly. Especially not under the heel of a woman he once tried to humiliate. Especially not with the walls of his legacy closing in around him, file by file, complaint by complaint, in the methodical grip of Deputy Chief Ayana Pierce. The day Ayana's preliminary findings reached the district attorney's office, Wade's strategy shifted from silence to survival. He could feel the tide pulling him under, his badge gone, his patrol stripped, his reputation collapsing under the weight of documented truth. But if there was one thing Wade Hunter understood, it was optics. He didn't need facts to win back control. He needed narrative. And so, the backlash began. It started with whispers. Officers in the hallway talking just a little louder when Ayana passed by. Old friends of Wade casually mentioning witch hunts and political posturing over break-room coffee. Wade, still on unpaid suspension, but very much active behind the scenes, called in favors. He reached out to former colleagues, sympathetic reporters, and a few carefully selected politicians who had benefited over the years from his law and order image. The first article hit local headlines just after noon on a Wednesday. The title, "Decorated Officer Targeted in Power Grab. Sources question motives behind Internal Affairs Probe." The byline belonged to a journalist known more for outrage than accuracy, but it didn't matter. The seed had been planted. By that evening, Wade's media campaign was in full motion. He appeared via video call on a popular conservative talk show hosted by a man with slicked-back hair and a smile that never touched his eyes. Wade, dressed in a crisp collared shirt and seated in front of an American flag, spoke solemnly to the camera. "This isn't about misconduct," he said, his voice low and rehearsed. "This is about a political agenda, about dismantling traditional policing. I served this city for over 20 years. I protected families. I kept the peace. And now they're trying to destroy everything we built because I stood up for order." The host nodded sympathetically, shaking his head. "It's disturbing. And who's behind this so-called investigation?" Wade didn't flinch. "A woman with no field experience, no street command, just a file cabinet and a chip on her shoulder." He didn't say Ayana's name. He didn't have to. Over the next 48 hours, the narrative exploded. Conservative media outlets echoed the message across radio, television, and social platforms. Wade Hunter, a good cop taken down by woke politics. They painted Ayana as a bureaucrat with an agenda, spinning the investigation into a vendetta. One headline read, "Hero Cop Destroyed by Diversity Czar." Another, "The New Face of Anti-Police Radicalism." In Facebook comment sections and radio call-ins, the vitriol grew. She just wants to make a name for herself. She hates the badge. She's out for blood. But inside the precinct, the story didn't hold. Not to those who mattered. The files were real. The evidence undeniable. The quiet hallways remained quiet. Officers who had once slapped Wade's back now glanced away. Even Julian Marks, once his closest shadow, refused to answer his calls. Still, the noise outside grew louder. Protests formed outside City Hall, small, angry gatherings of badge-waving supporters shouting about justice for real cops. They carried signs that read, "Support Blue," "Not Bureaucracy," and chanted Wade's name as if he were a fallen hero. A group of retired officers held a press conference demanding Ayana's removal, claiming she was destabilizing the department. Inside her office, Ayana watched none of it. She didn't respond to the media frenzy. She didn't hold a press conference. She issued no statements, gave no interviews, and made no appeals for public understanding. Instead, she continued building the case. For every headline that called her a radical, she compiled another report. For every pundit who mocked her silence, she annotated another timeline. For every protester shouting her name in anger, she found another civilian whose voice had been silenced for years. She understood something Wade didn't. Facts don't need to yell. They only need to stand. Still, the attacks grew personal. One outlet dug into her family history, publishing the criminal record of a distant cousin, as if it reflected on her qualifications. A viral post claimed she was backed by anti-police activists and called her a feminist militant in uniform. Anonymous emails began landing in her inbox, most filled with slurs, others with veiled threats. One called her a disgrace to the badge. Another warned, "You'll get yours soon enough." She forwarded them all to her security team and kept working. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She knew Wade wanted a reaction. Any reaction. He wanted her to stumble, to lash out, to validate his image of her as emotional, unstable, unfit. But Ayana had spent her life navigating rooms that never wanted her there. This was nothing new. The noise was only noise. What mattered was what she knew. She knew Wade had lied. She had proof of manipulated reports, tampered evidence, ignored abuse. She knew he wasn't alone, that his downfall exposed more than a man. It exposed a structure, and she knew the backlash wasn't just about her. It was about fear. Fear of accountability. Fear of change. Fear of a system that could no longer protect its own. So she let them scream. While they spun stories, she drafted timelines. While they debated her character, she sent subpoenas. While they dragged her name through the dirt, she prepared the next round of indictments. She wasn't playing the same game. Because while Wade Hunter stood in front of cameras, clinging to a version of himself the world was beginning to doubt, Ayana Pierce was doing something far more dangerous. She was telling the truth. And soon, the truth would speak louder than any smear. The smear campaign had hit its peak. Wade Hunter's face was everywhere. On late-night news panels, in viral clips defending traditional policing, in glossy segments on national networks framing him as a fallen warrior in the battle against crime. And yet, for all the noise, all the shouting, and all the carefully constructed outrage, something was cracking beneath the surface. The truth wasn't just seeping out. It was rising, slowly, then all at once. It began on a rainy Thursday afternoon, around 3 o'clock, when an unmarked flash drive arrived at a small independent newsroom called District Echo. The envelope was unaddressed, postmarked from within city limits. Inside was one item, a video file labeled WH, July 2016, body cam footage. The editor, a quiet but relentless journalist named Dani Suarez, played it once, then again, then a third time, each time sitting farther forward in her chair. The footage wasn't pixelated. It wasn't hard to follow. It was clear, clean, and horrifying. In the video, a young black teenager, 16 years old at most, stood with his hands up in the alley behind a convenience store. His backpack lay open beside him, empty. His voice trembled as he said, "I didn't take anything, I swear." Then, from the edge of the frame, Wade Hunter appeared. No badge was visible, just a barked command. "Down!" The boy barely had time to kneel before Wade struck him. Once, twice, 3 times. The third blow was with a baton. The boy screamed. There was no resisting, no threat, no weapon. Just a child, and a man in uniform, and the brutality of unchecked power captured in 6 minutes and 41 seconds of digital clarity. By 5 o'clock, the video was uploaded. By 6, it was viral. By 8, it was everywhere. Twitter lit up first, then Instagram Reels. TikTok edits followed. Some slowed down with captions, others overlaid with past headlines that had praised Wade's decisive response under pressure. A new hashtag began trending within hours. Hunter Unmasked. And riding that wave was a voice that had long been waiting for a moment like this. Imani Gray, a civil rights activist, legal analyst, and former public defender, Imani had seen the rot from the inside. She'd battled systemic injustice not just in theory, but in courtrooms, one client at a time. And when she saw the video, she didn't hesitate. That same night, Imani went live to her 2 million followers on social media. Sitting in her living room, no script in hand, she spoke with a clarity that pierced straight through the noise. "This isn't about one bad cop," she said. "This is about an entire culture that let Wade Hunter thrive for over 20 years. That boy, he could have been mine, yours. And for too long, stories like his never made it past a complaint form no one read. But now we've got video. And with that comes accountability. Or we burn the whole thing down trying. The live stream exploded. 300,000 views in one night. More than 1 million by the weekend. The video reached every corner of the country. And suddenly, Wade Hunter was no longer the subject of debate. He was the evidence. Cable anchors began to walk back earlier sympathies. Editorial boards revised their stances. Politicians who once praised his record now avoided his name like poison. The backlash to the backlash had begun. Outside police headquarters, crowds began to form. First dozens, then hundreds. Protesters held signs not just with the teenager's name, Jordan Malone, confirmed the next day through civil records, but with other names too. Deshaun, Khalil, Tasha, Amir. They weren't just protesting Wade Hunter. They were mourning the many who never got footage, never got justice. Imani Gray joined the protests on day 2, standing shoulder to shoulder with mothers who had buried sons and daughters beneath silence. Microphone in hand, she said, "Every precinct that shielded this man is complicit. Every official who looked the other way fed the monster. But don't look at this as collapse. This is correction. What's falling apart was never built to hold justice anyway." News networks, once captivated by Wade's narrative of victimhood, now led with the body cam footage. The video played nightly alongside interviews with Jordan's family, who confirmed that in 2016 their complaint had been dismissed. "They told us it was a miscommunication," his mother said through tears. "They made us feel like we were lucky he wasn't killed." Ayana Pierce, watching the storm from her office, didn't flinch. She'd seen the video already, days before it leaked. It had been in the stack Julian Marks helped recover from the archived servers. She had kept it back intentionally, not as strategy, but out of respect for the boy, the family, the trauma. She wanted the truth to rise naturally, not be weaponized by politics. But now that it was out, she made her move. At a press briefing the next morning, Ayana stood before a crowded room and said 3 words that cut through the nation's grief like lightning. We believed them. She didn't list all the victims. She didn't name Wade. She didn't need to. Instead, she laid out the next steps: formal charges, an expanded federal review, a collaborative investigation with civil rights watchdogs and outside forensic analysts. She opened the department's doors, not for damage control, but for dissection. "This is not about restoring trust," she said. "It's about building something better than what betrayed it." And the public listened. For the first time, the system didn't feel impenetrable. It felt shaken. And in that shaking, something real, something long overdue, was beginning to surface. Wade, now isolated in his suburban home, couldn't stop the flood. His phone rang with reporters he didn't answer. Lawyers with bad news, former allies now afraid to be seen speaking his name. The flash drive had burned through his last defense: ambiguity. The facts were no longer in folders. They were in every phone, every feed, every living room. He tried to issue a statement through his attorney, something vague about context and stress, about unusual pressure that day. It didn't land. The court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict, and this time, the silence belonged to him. The rain returned the morning it all broke open. Not a downpour, but a steady, whispering drizzle that painted the courthouse steps in muted gray. It was just after 10 o'clock when the crowd began to gather. Reporters clutched umbrellas and camera crews adjusted their angles beneath plastic sheeting. The city had grown used to drama in the weeks since the video of Jordan Malone went viral. But this day was different. Because this wasn't a protest. It wasn't a leak. It wasn't a theory or a rallying cry. It was formal accountability. Inside the courthouse's marble atrium, Beneath the city's seal etched into stone stood Deputy Chief Ayana Pierce. Her uniform was immaculate, her stance unshaken, her voice steady as she addressed the podium. And beside her, just over her left shoulder, flanked by officers and legal staff, stood Captain Loretta Miles, the highest-ranking black woman in the city's police command. Tall, commanding, and fiercely respected, Miles had once mentored Ayana through her first months in internal affairs. Now, she stood shoulder to shoulder with her, lending weight not just to the moment, but to the institution itself. Ayana didn't waste time with emotion. She didn't start with rhetoric or preamble. She opened with a list. "Captain Wade Hunter," she said, voice echoing under the high-vaulted ceiling, "has been formally indicted by a grand jury on the following charges: 1 count of aggravated assault under color of authority, 4 counts of falsifying public records, and 3 counts of obstruction of justice." Flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. Reporters leaned in. Some gasped. But Ayana kept going. These charges stem not from a single event, but from a documented pattern of misconduct spanning over a decade. Our investigation uncovered 32 civilian complaints, 14 internal violations, and multiple instances of abuse that were either suppressed, ignored, or erased from departmental records. This indictment is not about a single officer. It is about the failure of a culture that protected him. Behind her, Captain Miles nodded once, her expression firm. Ayana concluded with the words that would lead every news cycle for the next 72 hours. Effective immediately, Captain Wade Hunter is no longer an active duty officer. His badge has been revoked. He will be surrendered for processing at 1 o'clock today. By noon, the precinct parking lot, once Wade Hunter's kingdom, was crawling with media vans and quiet stares. Inside, the tension was thick enough to taste. The officers who had once laughed at his jokes and echoed his orders now sat at desks, eyes flicking toward the windows, waiting. At 1 o'clock on the dot, Wade entered through the side entrance flanked by his attorney and 2 internal affairs officers. He wore a navy suit and dark sunglasses, but he wasn't hiding from the cameras. He was hiding from something else. Shame, maybe, or the sudden awareness that the system he once trusted to protect him had finally turned him in. Waiting for him at the front of the building was a small table. On it sat a wooden badge case, symbolic, ceremonial, used only in rare instances when an officer's status is formally stripped. He was told to approach. Ayana stood beside the table, eyes locked on him. She said nothing. A younger officer opened the case. Slowly, mechanically, Wade reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the one thing that had once made him untouchable: his badge. Shiny, gold-plated. Number 187. He paused, glanced at the cameras, then down at Ayana. She didn't blink. With a shaking hand, Wade placed the badge into the box. The lid was closed with a soft click, like the ceiling of a vault. Or a casket. A rustle passed through the crowd of onlookers. No cheers, no applause, just silence. Deep and still. The kind of silence that says, "This is how it ends." Captain Loretta Miles stepped forward then. Her voice was low, measured, but unflinching. "Captain Wade Hunter, your commission as an officer of this department is revoked. You are hereby relieved of duty and placed under legal custody pending trial." One of the internal affairs officers took Wade's arm, not forcefully, but with unmistakable finality, and led him away. The image was instantly iconic. The once feared captain, head down, walking through the front doors of his own precinct, not as a leader, but as a defendant. The footage aired on every network by nightfall. Ayana didn't grant interviews. She didn't issue a personal statement, but a press release from her office was circulated just before midnight. It read, "Today's events are not a punishment. They are a correction. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it must be justice delivered. We do not celebrate the fall of one man. We acknowledge the strength of those who endured his rise. Let this serve not as closure, but as the beginning of accountability. Across the city, reactions poured in. Civil rights groups held candlelight vigils not in anger, but in relief. Jordan Malone's family issued a brief but powerful message. We waited 9 years for this. We pray others won't have to. Activist Imani Gray, in a widely shared post, wrote, "A badge is not a shield against justice. Ayana Pierce is proof." Inside the department, the ripple effects were immediate. Files long dormant were reopened. Officers who had felt voiceless came forward. A shift in language began to take hold, not bad apples, but broken structures, not isolated incidents, but systemic rot. And through it all, Ayana stayed in motion. There were no victory laps, no grand gestures, just more work, more files, more names that deserved attention. But even she couldn't ignore the gravity of what had just happened. Because this moment, this indictment, this badge relinquished in full view of the city, was not just about Wade Hunter's fall. It was about the first real evidence that power could be held to account, even when it wears a uniform. A week later, a mural appeared near the courthouse. It showed a hand placing a badge into a box. In the background stood a shadowed figure in uniform. Not Wade, but Ayana, her face half-turned, her eyes forward. Painted across the top were 5 words. Truth isn't loud, it lasts. Power doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, flake by flake, like rust beneath polished metal. And after the indictment, after Wade Hunter handed over his badge and walked out of the precinct in disgrace, the erosion began to show. Not in headlines this time, but in glances, in whispers, in what wasn't said. For 20 years, Captain Wade Hunter ruled that precinct like a warlord wrapped in protocol. His word was gospel, his office untouchable. His laugh, loud, sharp, meant to intimidate, once echoed through the halls like a reminder of who mattered most. But now, just 1 week after Ayana Pierce made the indictment public, that laugh was gone. And in its place was silence. Inside the station's break room, where Hunter had once held court with ease, telling stories about taming the streets and real police work, officers now sat in tight circles, heads close, eyes darting. The chair he used to claim without question sat empty, pushed just slightly back from the table like a relic too dangerous to touch. When his name came up, it was no longer in reverence. It was in jokes. Quiet, barbed jokes. Ones whispered with just enough volume to signal change. Guess Wade finally found out what a perp feels like. He ever file a report that didn't start with "he came at me"? I heard they found a drawer full of fake citations in his desk. Legend. None of them would have dared say those things a month ago. But the myth of Wade Hunter had cracked wide open. And now, the men and women who once feared or followed him were trying to unhook themselves from the wreckage. The locker room, once his kingdom, became hostile territory. His name, once uttered like a title, now hung in the air like a bad odor. New recruits, who had arrived just weeks before the scandal, watched the old guard unravel. They saw how quickly reverence could turn to ridicule, how silence could rot a legacy. But no moment marked the generational divide more clearly than Julian Marks's testimony. It happened in a closed-door deposition with Internal Affairs and 2 federal prosecutors. But word spread fast. Julian, the young officer who had once shadowed Wade like a loyal apprentice, had sat down, sworn in, and told the truth. He spoke for nearly 3 hours. Calm, clear, unflinching. He recounted the stops Wade escalated for no reason. The suspects cuffed, and still hit. The body cam footage that was accidentally deleted. He confirmed the reports Ayana's team had surfaced and added new ones no one had found. He gave names, dates, details. But most damning of all, he spoke about how Wade taught him to ignore conscience. He used to say, "We do what's necessary. Paperwork will catch up to the truth." And for a long time, I believed him, Julian said. But now I know. That wasn't policing. That was performance. That was power for power's sake. It wasn't just testimony. It was an indictment of an entire mindset. When Julian exited the deposition room that afternoon, he didn't go back to the squad floor. He walked straight to Ayana's office and handed her something, an old photo. It showed him and Wade standing in front of their patrol car, both smiling. On the back, Julian had written one sentence, "I won't be that man." Inside the precinct, his choice sent a shockwave. Some called him a traitor. Others whispered respect. But no one could deny it. The lines were shifting. Wade felt it too. From his temporary holding residence pending trial, he called former colleagues, men who had once cheered him after violent arrests. Most didn't answer. A few sent short replies, "Can't talk. Wish you well." He tried Julian once. The call went to voicemail, and as the silence grew heavier, the collapse became personal. The chief of police, pressured by city officials, ordered Wade's name removed from the internal commendation board. Photos featuring him in award ceremonies were quietly taken down. One officer claimed they saw Wade's locker emptied overnight, its nameplate discarded in a trash bin behind the station. The younger recruits, once eager to impress him, now treated his legacy like a cautionary tale. It wasn't just his job that had been stripped. It was his identity. A man who once swaggered through doors expecting obedience now faced a world that barely looked up when his name was mentioned. A captain who commanded fear now inspired only distance. And in that vacuum, something new began to take root. Honesty. Ayana noticed it during her precinct visits. Officers no longer dodged her in the hallways. A few even approached her directly. One young sergeant asked how to file a formal report against a supervisor without retaliation. Another quietly left a folder on her desk. 6 years of unresolved complaints, previously ignored. Captain Loretta Miles called it the purge after the storm. Fear kept them silent for years, she said. Now they're realizing what happens when silence breaks. Ayana didn't call it a victory. She called it a beginning. Because the collapse of Wade Hunter wasn't just a man falling. It was a structure buckling under its own weight. And the groans of that failure, those strained beams and loosened bricks, could be heard in every office, every case file, every room where someone once said, "That's just how it's done." Not anymore. Outside, the public continued to watch. Media outlets tracked every motion, every court filing. Protesters still came to the courthouse, but now their signs said things like, "Protect the truth-tellers," and "Let the new guard rise." Julian's name appeared in articles not as a whistleblower, but as a reformer. People called him brave. Some called him late. But everyone agreed. His break from Wade marked something irreversible. Inside his cell, Wade watched it all unfold from a television mounted near the ceiling. Alone, unnamed in public statements, referred to now only as the accused, and in precinct hallways where his shadow once lingered, a different kind of presence filled the space. It wasn't fear. It was reckoning. The gavel came down like thunder in a silent room. It was just past 10:30 on a warm Wednesday morning when the judge read the sentence aloud. 15 years without parole. A murmur swept across the courtroom like wind through dry grass, followed by stillness, thick, heavy, almost reverent. At the defense table, Wade Hunter sat motionless, his jaw clenched, eyes staring straight ahead, as if the words had not landed, or perhaps had landed too hard. He had worn a charcoal gray suit to court, the same one from his media appearances months before, now wrinkled and faded. But there were no cameras here, no microphones, just a judge, a verdict, and the long shadow of everything he'd tried to deny. Wade didn't speak at sentencing. His lawyers had advised against it. Let the record speak for itself, they had said. But the record had spoken, loudly, clearly, and without mercy. The prosecution had presented a staggering timeline of abuse: body cam footage, doctored reports, deleted evidence, silenced victims. 14 complaints resurfaced. 5 were supported by recovered digital records. 2 victims testified in person. One mother cried from the gallery as her son's name was read into the record for the first time. Jordan Malone, beaten in an alley for doing nothing but looking afraid. Wade's defense tried to frame it as stress, as the weight of a broken system, but the jury didn't buy it. Neither did the judge. This was not failure under pressure, the judge said in his closing remarks. This was sustained, strategic, and protected violence. And now Wade was going to prison, not for one mistake, but for years of unchecked cruelty. He didn't flinch, but inside, a war raged. The ride to the penitentiary was quiet. The seatbelt cut against his suit. The cuffs bit his wrists. He stared out the window, watching the city blur past like a place he'd never really seen. And maybe he hadn't. Maybe for all the years he claimed to serve and protect it, he never truly looked at the people, only their shadows, only their profiles, only the threat he imagined in every gesture. At intake, a corrections officer asked for his name. He hesitated, then answered, "Wade, Hunter." The officer didn't blink. "You're 82249 now." The steel door closed behind him with a sound unlike any he'd heard in his 2 decades on the force. A deep, final clank that seemed to echo not just in the hall, but in his chest. His cell was bare. A cot, a toilet, a shelf with a chipped cup, and silence. There, in the gray between concrete and regret, Wade sat down and did what he hadn't done in months. He thought, not about the victims, not about justice, about himself. He replayed it all, his rise, his fall, the court proceedings, the headlines. He seethed at Ayana Pierce, muttered curses under his breath. He blamed the political machine, the media circus, the cowards who turned on him. But never, not once, did he admit guilt. Not even to himself. In his mind, he was still the good cop brought down by politics. Even as the bars closed around him, back in the city, where his name had once made officers stand straighter or citizens turn away in fear, the tone had changed completely. Gone were the photos of Wade in command. Gone were the plaques with his name. And in their place came something far more powerful: reform. At the heart of it all stood Ayana Pierce, no longer the quiet disruptor, but now the clearest voice in a fractured department. While Wade sat bitter in a 10-by-10 cell, Ayana walked precinct floors with a quiet steadiness. She wasn't there to gloat. She was there to rebuild. She met with new recruits and explained the importance of body cam integrity. She sat with veteran officers and challenged them to unlearn what had once been called good instincts. She revised reporting protocols, ending the loopholes Wade once slipped through. She launched a transparency initiative, inviting civilian oversight into internal investigations. And perhaps most revolutionary of all, she created a protected channel for officers to report misconduct anonymously, a signal that silence was no longer a requirement for survival. Captain Loretta Miles stood with her every step of the way, reminding the department that real leadership isn't built on fear. It's built on truth, accountability, and the courage to stand alone when necessary. Outside headquarters, Murals bloomed across city walls. One showed Ayana standing firm, clipboard in hand, a storm of papers swirling around her like armor. Another depicted Jordan Malone with a gold halo behind his head, hands raised in the alley, but this time with witnesses surrounding him. No longer invisible. And as the city moved forward, something shifted beneath the surface. A sense of balance, tentative but growing. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was possible. Julian Marks, now reassigned to training duties, stood before a fresh class of cadets one morning and held up an old badge. It wasn't his, it wasn't Wade's. It belonged to a retired officer who had mentored with integrity. Julian spoke only a few words. This isn't power, this is permission, and you can lose it the second you stop earning it. The cadets nodded. Some even wrote it down. And high above them, in the executive office with frosted windows and a file-strewn desk, Ayana watched the precinct breathe again. Slowly, cautiously, but freely. She didn't need applause. She didn't need monuments. Her reward was in the quiet. In the officer who hesitated before using force. In the mother who finally felt safe enough to file a complaint. In the boy who didn't look down when a cruiser passed by. That was her legacy. Not the fall of Wade Hunter, but the rise of something better. What happened to Wade Hunter is more than a cautionary tale. It's a mirror. A reflection of what happens when power is allowed to walk unchecked for 20 years. When silence replaces accountability. When fear becomes policy. And when the system protects its own at the expense of the people it claims to serve. But there's something else here, too. Something vital. What we witnessed through Ayana Pierce wasn't just justice. It was transformation. The kind that begins with a single voice, a single act of courage, and ripples outward. For too long, Americans have been told that reform is impossible, that the system is too big, too old, too tangled in tradition to change. But change does not wait for permission. It waits for people, ordinary citizens, willing to see, to speak, and to act. If there's a lesson in this story, it's this. Power is not permanent. But truth is, we as citizens are not spectators. We are stakeholders in our justice system. Every vote cast for a city council member, every demand for transparency, every question asked at a town hall. These are the tools of change. And for those working inside the system, like Ayana Pierce, integrity must be non-negotiable. Because the badge you wear is not just metal, it's meaning. And that meaning is defined by what you protect and what you refuse to ignore. So what do we do next? We stay alert. We hold leaders accountable. We ask who gets silenced and why. We speak out when the system chooses comfort over justice. This story is a chapter, but the book is still being written, and your voice matters. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you that silence can be deadly, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel. It takes less than 30 seconds, but it helps carry these stories into the hands of people who need to see them. People who still believe change is impossible. Be the reason they think again. One story at a time, we can rewrite the narrative. And it starts with you. Because justice, without action, is just a wish. Let's turn it into a promise. Together.